Reduced to the role of a glorified butler for all these freaks was certainly a low point in this fucked up rodeo called my life. Looking around the kitchen like an idiot for the wine that was requested, I was moments from giving up and facing Krill's wrath, when a little tug at my side caught my attention. Pulling Tempe out of my pocket, I saw that the little voodoo doll was pointing in the direction of a cabinet. Walking over and opening it up, I breathed a sigh of relief as I reached out and grabbed one of the bottles of wine. "I owe you one," I told the little doll, placing him back in my pocket and sighing as I started back towards the dining room. Stopping at the door and taking a deep breath, I put on my stupid smile and exited the kitchen, and walked into a scene that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Three Stooges short. "Eat with a fork, you disgusting freak," Sinclair shouted at the long-haired Garibaldi. He was seemingly eating an entire rotisserie chicken by himself. Garibaldi was the odd one out of the four creatures seated at the table. While they all wore suits, he wore a Red Ringleader's shirt, his nails painted, and even his eyes threw me off when he turned to look at me, seemingly ignoring Sinclair's shouts and curses. "There you are, Travis. Seems like you've almost been gone a month," he chuckled, motioning me to come over with the bottle of wine I was holding on to. Nodding, I kept the stupid fake smile on my face and walked over to the table, carefully placing it on the table and backing away slightly. "Leave it to you to turn the boy into a doormat," Sinclair hissed, turning his attention from the increasingly messy scene of Garibaldi eating over to the two of us. Sinclair peered at me with his deeply sunken eyes. I did my best to keep the smile plastered on my face, praying that Krill still hadn't noticed that he no longer was controlling me. "Boy, go get me a cigar," the man ordered me, pointing at me and snapping his fingers at me. I looked over at Krill to see if he was okay with this, but my captor was far too busy talking to Monsieur LeBlanc to have even noticed what had been ordered of me. Nodding to him, I walked over to a small table set up near the kitchen's entrance. A box full of cigars sitting there. I took one out and acted like I knew what I was doing with it, trying to remember how my father used to smoke his. Snipping the end off with the cutter, I walked back over to Sinclair and handed it to him, fishing in my pockets and taking out a Zippo that I had also taken from the table. As I flipped it open and tried to spark it, my hand was grabbed by the black mass that followed Sinclair everywhere. Looking up in fear, I managed to get a good look at the creature as it stared at me. White eyes stared back at me. It was vaguely human-shaped, but appeared to be dripping, and its lower half was firmly stuck to the wall. "You don't light a cigar with a fucking lighter, you stupid shit stain," the man hissed at me, standing up from his seat at the table and reaching out to grab me by my collar. He had the look of murderous rage on his face, and I was sure he would do something horrible to me, when all of a sudden a loud crash pulled both of our attention over towards Krill. He was standing up, gritting his teeth, his cane embedded in the table with just how hard he had smacked it down. "You best be letting go of my clerk before you lose that fucking hand, Sinclair," Krill hissed, that same murderous look on his buttons as he stared at us both. Sinclair scoffed and shoved me away, him and his shadow creature turning their attention towards Krill. "Maybe if you taught him how to light a cigar properly, I wouldn't have to educate him," Sinclair spat, lifting the cigar I had cut up to his lips and taking his seat. His shadow produced a match for him and carefully lit it for him. I meanwhile had been caught by the strings and regained my fake composure, a smile still on my face. "Travis, be a dear and go to the kitchen. I have to teach Mr. Sinclair here a lesson," Krill said sweetly to me, pulling his cane out of the wood and walking over to Sinclair. I didn't bother to stay and watch as I quickly nodded and ducked into the kitchen, waiting till the door closed behind me before starting to hyperventilate. Being nearly touched by Sinclair had sent me over the edge, and I was reduced to a complete mess. I was barely able to hold myself up. "Why does this shit keep happening to me?" I whimpered, putting my hands over my mouth and panting hard as I tried to regain some composure. Feeling soft hugs coming to my side, I reached my pocket inside and pulled Tempe out. His little arms were raised up at me, and I collapsed to the floor, hugging the little plush doll close as I was near seconds from sobbing. Finally, having regained some composure, I rubbed his little head as thanks, and put him back in my pocket. Looking around the kitchen for a weapon, I settled on a steak knife having been left in the sink to be cleaned. Stuffing that into my pocket as well, I turned to return to the feast. Assuming it was safe to do so, Krill and Sinclair were sitting back down, and seemingly ignoring the others' presence. "Ah, Travis, my boy. Good that you're back. Seems we have some unwanted company at the shop." My blood ran cold as he said this. "Could you be a dear, and go deal with them?" he said with a smile, which produced a snort from Sinclair, who wiped his mouth with his napkin. "Same reason why you use the blonde whore at your rehab center, to do all your dirty work," he chuckled, licking his plate of all the juices that had dripped out of his chicken, which was completely gone, bones and all. Sinclair rose from his seat and walked past me, his shadow getting goop on my shoes as he did. Grabbing Garibaldi from the hair, he slammed him down on the plate and proceeded to shove his face into it. "Act like the disgusting insect you are, and I shall treat you as such," he shouted, his shadow giving him a hand and shoving the ringleader into his own plate. Sinclair rose from his seat and walked past me, his shadow getting goop on my shoes as he did. Grabbing Garibaldi from the hair, he slammed him down on the plate and proceeded to shove his face into it. "Act like the disgusting insect you are, and I shall treat you as such," he shouted, his shadow giving him a hand and shoving the ringleader into his own plate. "Careful, bugs bite." Garibaldi snickered as his voice became distorted and another sickening crunch came from his head. Peeking over Krill's seat at his face, I saw that Garibaldi's face had split open from the scar on his face, and a row of teeth and a tongue made itself known. "Careful, bugs bite." Garibaldi snickered as his voice became distorted and another sickening crunch came from his head. Peeking over Krill's seat at his face, I saw that Garibaldi's face had split open from the scar on his face, and a row of teeth and a tongue made itself known. "Sorry, Travis. They always do that. Please be dear, and deal with the guests in the shop. I'll handle them here." He chuckled, giving me a firm pat on the shoulder, and sending me on my way. Nodding quickly, I turned to go, and escape from this increasingly horrible dinner. "Right away, King Krill, sir," I said in my kiss-ass tone, and quickly stepped over to the door. Mere inches away from it, I felt a hard clammy hand grip my wrist. Nearly letting out a scream, I looked over to see the wheelchair-bound LeBlanc seemingly sniffing at me, and looking up at me with his silver mask firmly on his face. "You've already eaten, monsieur. Besides, you'll get indigestion with this undead creature," his nurse told him, grabbing his hand and prying it off of me. Looking at her, I barely even gave her thanks as I left her and everyone behind, going out the door and nearly slamming it behind me, panting hard and wanting to cry now more than ever. "Travis," came a soft little voice I was more than familiar with. Turning and seeing Olivia with Brian, I did start crying, even if no tears came out. Falling to my knees as she came over to me, I wrapped my arms around her and squeezed her. She did as well with all her little might. Pulling back a bit, I reached into my pocket and produced Tempe for her. She started bawling her eyes out when she saw him, and quickly scooped him up in her arms. "I gotta say, man," Brian suddenly spoke up, causing me to look over at him. "Your hair looks a lot better when it's all messy." I couldn't help but let out a genuine chuckle at that, as I stood up and offered my fist out to my roommate-turned-friend. He smiled and returned the fist bump and made room for Riley. I swallowed hard when I saw her, quickly looking back at Brian. "It's okay." He filled me in. "Kinda, it was hard to understand." He paraphrased a lot. She chuckled. I looked over to Brian, who gave me a thumbs up as he lifted up a still crying Olivia into his arms. I looked back at Riley and sighed hard at her. "Sorry for what I heard what he said," I mumbled to her, rubbing my arm and avoiding making eye contact with her. She chuckled and went to give me a hug, only for me to back up away from her. Right. You've been through a lot, Travis. I'm really sorry for everything. She told me, keeping her distance from me. I smiled at her and moved my hand through my hair, finally being able to look at her with a soft smile of my own. How sweet. Krill chuckled as he closed the door to the dinner behind him, causing all of us to stare at him in horror. Seems you broke free, Travis. I'll give you props, boy. You had me completely fooled. He chuckled, tapping his cane on the floor of the new Voodoo shop. I backed up away from him as the strings once again pulled tight on my body, and I was forced to walk my way over to him, that stupid smile plastered on my face. Let Travis go. Olivia screamed at the top of her little lungs, thrashing around in Brain's arms. Krill jerked his head over to her, and smiled as he walked over to her. Brian started backing up and Krill stopped in his tracks. Travis. He turned to me with a smile, walking back over, and grabbing me by the arms. Be a good boy, and get Olivia for me. He patted me on the head, and backed away as I was forced to nod, and fished the knife out of my pocket. Right away, sir. I hummed, walking over towards Brian who kept backing away from me. I tried desperately to try and fight the strings. I did my best, but the loud smack on the back of my head really helped me out. Collapsing to the floor like a sack of potatoes, my head turned to see Riley having hit me in the back of the head with a tire iron. Definitely ranks up there in terms of the pain of things inflicted on me. He's done following your orders. Riley shouted at Krill, lifting the tire iron up at the Voodoo man. He chuckled and raised his arms up, to which my body did the exact same thing as it was pulled up by the strings. The only thing Riley had really accomplished was knocking out my physical body. The strings now much more easily controlled me. Chuckling, Krill spun on his heels and headed back towards the dining room. Travis. Be a dear, and see that your friends are taken care of. Krill hummed, walking to the door, and closing it shut behind him as he entered it. I was being pulled around harder than ever before as I fished the knife from the floor, and waved it about in front of me. Wordlessly I slashed at Riley, as she did her best to try and stop me from doing it. Travis. Snap out of it. Riley screamed as she lifted her arms up in a defensive pose. I slashed her deep in her arms as she backed up and screamed at me to stop. As I lifted up my knife to slash her deeply, I suddenly was stabbed in the back of my leg. The strings twisted my head to look down and see that it was Olivia. She held up a tiny pocket knife as she desperately stabbed at me. Stop it, Travis. Please. Olivia shouted, mixing her little stabbings with pointings of her fist. Looking down at her and realizing that without Alexandra that she was going to be all alone, I mustered what little strength I had in my body and lifted the knife up, bringing it down on a few of the strings that became tangled in the blade. When I had lifted the knife up quickly, the threads were cut and half of me went flopping to the floor as I fell next to Olivia. Getting the idea, Olivia quickly came over to me and started cutting the strings that remained off of me. Setting her tiny knife down, she kneeled next to me and made strained little grunts as she tried to force me to sit up. Her little hands never made me flinch in fear. I knew that she genuinely cared for me. Steadying myself as some of my motor functions came back, Brian and Riley quickly came over to offer the help I needed to stand back up. Thanks guys, I said softly, rubbing the back of my head, where Riley had conked me. Somewhat thankful that I really couldn't be killed by head trauma. Leaning on Brian, we started for the entrance, only to find it chained from the outside. Got to give you kids some props. You all are a persistent bunch. Krill chuckled as he drummed his fingers on the counter. He sat there next to the cash register. His gloved fingers drummed happily on the desk as he looked up at us. Of course, I can't just let you all leave with my school clerk. Bad for business, if I just let employees do whatever they want. Krill reached an arm behind the counter and produced a voodoo doll of me before us all. Swallowing hard, I looked down at Olivia and at everyone. Pushing off of Brian, I slowly stumbled and approached Krill, who raised a brow at me coming towards him. Coming up to the counter, I slammed my hand down in front of him and pointed my finger at him.